We're ready to begin. The subcommittee will come to order. I'd like to begin by welcoming the members who are joining the hearing remotely. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get into the actual hearing itself. To those members, those members are reminded that they must be visible on screen within the software platform for the purposes of identity verification when joining the proceeding, establishing and maintaining a quorum, participating in the proceeding, and voting. Members participating remotely must continue to use the software platform's video function while attending the proceedings unless they experience connectivity issues or other technical problems that render the member unable to fully participate on camera. If a member who is participating remotely experiences technical difficulties, please contact the committee staff for assistance and they will help you get recognized. When recognized, video of remotely attending members' participation will be broadcast in the room and via television, internet feeds. Members participating remotely are asked to mute their microphone when they are not speaking. Members participating remotely will be recognized normally for asking questions, but if they want to speak at another time, they must seek recognition verbally. In all cases, members are reminded to unmute their microphone prior to speaking. Members should be aware that there is a slight lag of a few seconds between the time you start speaking and the camera shot switching to you. Members who are participating remotely are reminded to keep the software platform's video function on for the entirety of the time they attend the proceeding. Those members may leave and rejoin the proceeding. If members depart for a short period for reasons other than joining a different proceeding, they should leave the video function on. If members will be absent for a significant period or depart to join a different proceeding, they should exit the software platform entirely and then rejoin if they return. Members are also advised that I have designated a committee staff member to, if necessary, mute unrecognized members' microphones to cancel any inadvertent background noise that may disrupt the proceeding. Members may use the software platform's chat feature to communicate with staff regarding technical or logistical support issues only. Finally, remotely participating members should see a 5-minute countdown clock on the software platform's display, but if necessary, I will remind members when their time is up. So with the logistics clarified, I will want to begin by welcoming everyone to today's hearing on the findings of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, a congressionally mandated commission created in the FY 2019 NDAA that was charged with developing a consensus on a strategic approach to defending the United States in cyberspace against cyber attacks of significant consequence. Inspired by Project Solarium, a task force assembled by President Eisenhower in the early 1950s, the Solarium Commission brought together representatives from academia and the private sector with representatives of the executive branch and legislative branches. In the spirit of transparency, I want to make clear that I had the distinct privilege of being selected by Speaker Nancy Pelosi to serve as one of the 4 elected members of Congress to serve as a commissioner, and one of 2 from the House of Representatives, along with our distinguished subcommittee colleague, Congressman Mike Gallagher, who is appearing as a witness before us today. Mr. Gallagher, along with Senator King, the junior senator from Maine, also was a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee and Senate Intelligence Committees, is also with us today. They serve as co-chairs of the commission, and I am very proud to call them both colleagues and friends. This subcommittee, more than most, has heard from numerous individuals on the centrality of cyberspace to our modern lives. The novelty of the Solarium's work and its findings is in examining how to secure cyberspace with an emphasis on a whole of government approach. Congress is methodical in its views of jurisdiction and And we are often too focused on viewing our oversight responsibilities exclusively through the lens of committee jurisdictions. What the Solarium Commission has presented in its final report, completed on March 11th of this year, is a blueprint for legislative and executive actions that force the country to break apart the institutional stovepipes. In this respect, I see the findings of the Solarium Commission as being similar to those of the 9/11 Commission, in that both bodies recognized government silos that had been artificially constructed and harmed the national approach to addressing cross-cutting issues. Whereas the 9/11 Commission applied this to the problem of terrorism, Solarium applies it to cyberspace. The Commission's recommendations have resulted in more than 20 provisions in this year's National Defense Authorization Act, passed just last week by the House of Representatives. In that one bill, this chamber was able to address matters as diverse as reserve support for military cyber operations, to the cyber insurance marketplace, to the establishment of a Senate-confirmed National Cyber Director. While we obviously have more work to do, I'm proud of the NDAA, that the NDAA reflects the whole of government action called for by the Commission. I applaud the example set by European partners, in particular, in approaching cyber in novel and holistic ways, as recent as today, with the announcement of the first ever cyber sanctions issued through the European Union against 6 individuals and 3 entities responsible for the WannaCry, NotPetya, and Operation Cloudhopper attacks. This is going to be essential going forward in enforcing international norms, and this is a concrete step toward making sure that there are consequences to actions that violate norms in cyberspace on the international front. As I noted earlier, we have 4 witnesses appearing in front of the subcommittee today. In addition to the distinguished gentleman from Wisconsin and Maine, we are also joined by 2 additional commissioners. The Honorable Patrick Murphy, a former member of the House of Representatives from Pennsylvania, is here today. Commissioner Murphy has served with distinction as an acting secretary and undersecretary of the Army. He's a former member of the House Armed Services Committee, and today continues his service as distinguished chair of innovation at the United States Military Academy. Commissioner Murphy was the first veteran of the war in Iraq to be elected to Congress. Finally, we have Commissioner Frank Cilluffo, who, in addition to his service with the Solarium Commission, serves as the director of Auburn University McCrary Institute for Cyber and Critical Infrastructure Security. From 2001 to 2003, Commissioner Cilluffo served as Special Assistant to President Bush on Homeland Security, and then led the Center for Cyber and Homeland Security at George Washington University. So I welcome all of our witnesses here today. I thank them for their extraordinary work on the Cyber Solarium Commission. Your input and your insights were absolutely invaluable. Before we hear from our witnesses, I do want to turn to Ranking Member Stefanik for her opening comments.
Thank you, Chairman Langevin. Welcome to our witnesses, Senator King, Congressman Gallagher, Congressman Murphy, and Mr. Cilluffo. It is great to have you before the subcommittee today. I thank you not only for your leadership and service to the Cyber Solarium Commission, but your long and distinguished records of public service to this country. And although you're not testifying today, I also want to thank Chairman Langevin for his service on the commission, as well as all of the other commissioners who are not participating today. It is truly remarkable how much ground the Cyber Solarium was able to cover in such a brief period of time. In 11 short months, the Commission developed over 50 legislative proposals, 22 of which were included in the House-passed version of the National Defense Authorization Act. This impressive commitment reflects the hard work of the commissioners and the staff, and also recognition that we must address these issues immediately. As is often the case, our nation's strategy, policy, and laws trail the advent of new technology. This is especially true of many emerging disciplines, but none quite as consequential as cyberspace. The debilitating cyber attack on Estonia in 2007, the devastating Office of Personnel Management data breach in 2014, and the cyber attack on the city of Atlanta in 2018 all should have served as wake-up calls for the need of a comprehensive strategy to bolster our cyber defenses, to deter hostile action in cyberspace, and to build more resilient public and private cyber infrastructure. The threat actors in cyberspace are as diverse as the tools and tradecraft they employ to infiltrate and attack our networks. And while we must maintain a flexible and adaptable approach to meet the evolving threat, we must also communicate an unequivocal position that demonstrates our willingness to defend the United States in cyberspace and impose cost on our adversaries if and when deterrence fails. I firmly believe we must simultaneously strengthen our cyber defenses and demonstrate our unwavering resolve to challenge our adversaries in cyberspace. I appreciate the Commission's recognition of this as well. Deterrence alone is not sufficient, especially with the challenges of timely attribution and the notional fog of war in cyberspace. The United States must proactively take steps to increase the resilience of our networks and our nation's critical infrastructure. This task is not one that the federal government can take on alone. Any effort to bolster our cybersecurity must be done in partnership with the private sector, our cities and states, and our critical infrastructure operators. The Commission's recommendations that were included in the NDAA address this reality. Accountability, information sharing, collaboration, and more timely response and mitigation to cyber incidents are all critical attributes that we must reinforce and strengthen. While the Commission is coming to an end, the work is not done. We have a long road ahead to see through conference and fully implement these changes. I look forward to ensuring the Cyber Solarium's recommendations are translated into concrete policy action. We have a lot to talk about today, so thank you to our witnesses, and I yield back.
I want to thank the ranking member for those comments. And before we turn to our witnesses, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the extraordinary work of the staff of the Cyber Solarium Commission, starting with Mark Montgomery and the entire team that he assembled that served the commission so well. And I also want to, of course, mention my own staff, my legislative director, Nick Leiserson, as well as on the committee staff, Josh Stiefel, for their subsequent work on seeing that the findings were put into action and getting them into the NDAA. But extraordinary effort all the way around. I can't say enough about the work of the entire staff, again, led by Mark Montgomery. We thank them for their contributions and their service. So with that, we'll turn to our witnesses now. Senator King, we'll begin with you. The floor is now yours for any comments you may have.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the ranking member for those eloquent statements. You stated the case. I can save part of my remarks. I do have written remarks, which I would like to submit for the record, if subject to your approval, Mr. Chairman. And I'll have some informal remarks now. First, I want to thank this committee and thank the full committee for the work that you've already done on this critically important subject, the work that's went into the National Defense Authorization Act that, of course, has now passed both houses. Both bills from the Senate and the House have a number of our recommendations. There's not in 100% overlap, so there will be some work to do in conference, but we certainly have made a substantial start in really putting these recommendations, implementing the recommendations, because if it's just a report that sits on a shelf, it's not going to serve the public interest. Just a bit about the commission. You talked about it, Mr. Chairman. There were 14 members. There were 4 members of Congress, 4 members from the executive branch, and 6 from the private sector. Our work was entirely nonpartisan. There wasn't a moment of partisan discussion in the 30-plus meetings that we had. In fact, I couldn't tell you the partisan affiliations of pretty much anyone that was in the room, except, of course, the members of Congress. And that was the spirit with which we approached this incredibly important problem. I don't really need to outline for this committee how serious this is. This is one of the, if not the most serious international relations problem that we face. The ranking member listed the attacks that we've already endured, and there will certainly be more to come. We are the most wired country in the world, and therefore we're the most vulnerable country in the world. And as we've learned in the pandemic, something which strikes at our essential economy and government poses a grave danger to this country. So let me just give you a brief outline of how the work of the Solarium sort of breaks down. If there are really three pieces. One is reorganization, one is resilience, and one is response. Reorganization means trying to develop a coherent structure in the United States government so that we can respond to cyber threats and cyber attacks. The problem, as is often the case, is that the authority for cyber is scattered throughout the government. It's in the FBI, it's in Cyber Command, it's in CIA, DHS, it's in all areas of the government. So one of our primary focus was on bringing some coherent organizational strategy to that silo problem, which the chairman mentioned. The principal recommendation there is one that you've already adopted in your committee, which is the creation of a national cyber director to oversee and coordinate all of these various functions throughout the federal government. The second piece is resilience, which is building up our cyber defenses. And it goes from simple cyber hygiene to being just more secure in how we deal with the cloud, how we certify home routers and all of those kinds of things in order to be more resilient, to make it less likely that an adversary will succeed. The third piece is response. How do we respond to a cyber attack? And more importantly, how do we notify potential adversaries that we will respond? And we'll be talking about that. And all of these three pieces come into what's called layered cyber deterrence. The intention is to shape behavior. We'll be talking about that in the international field of norms and standards. The second is to deny benefits. That's the resilience that I was talking about. And the third piece is impose costs. The truth is that we haven't done a very good job of imposing costs. We've become a cheap date in cyber. We can be attacked, as we were with the OPM breach the ranking member mentioned, or other attacks on our democracy, and there's no real consequences. There are no real results. There's no cost paid by our adversary. We've got to make adversaries go through a cost calculation saying, well, if we do this, they might do this something else to us. And it may not be cyber, it may be sanctions, it may be other kinds of a response. But we have to establish that there will be a response. Otherwise, because cyber is a relatively cheap form of aggression, it will continue to happen. So that's the overall focus of our commission. And I have to say, working with the two members from your subcommittee, Jim Langevin and Mike Gallagher, has been one of the great pleasures of my life. We've had a fantastic experience working together with the other 12 members of the commission, really wrestling with some difficult issues, working hard, concentrating, and coming up with what we feel is a solid piece of work that will really help our country move forward in this critically important area. So I thank the subcommittee for your attention and look forward to the hearing.
Very good. Thank you, Senator King, for those remarks, and again for your extraordinary leadership in co-chairing the Cyber Solarium Commission and your commitment to public service. The citizens of Maine have chosen wisely in having you as their senator. With that, let me now turn to our colleague on the House Armed Services Committee, the co-chair of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, Chairman Mike Gallagher. Co-Chairman Mike Gallagher.
Thank you, Chairman Langevin. Let me state at the outset that this is the most nervous I've ever been sitting in this room with all of you. But thank you, Chairman Langevin, for your leadership, and particularly, there was a 2-week stretch when NDA was happening where I was out of commission because my wife had a baby, and Jim stepped up and really led the way in terms of making a forceful argument for a lot of our recommendations and getting them included into NDAA. And really, Project Solarium, or the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, represent the culmination of a lot of work that Jim has been doing for decades. And so it was an honor to work with you. Ranking Member Stefanik, thank you for your input into the report and all of your contributions in this space and your leadership. I too have a official written statement that I'd like to submit for the record, if that's okay.
Sure, without objection, so ordered.
And in an attempt to be brief, I'll just say a few things. When I first approached then Speaker Paul Ryan and asked him to consider me for this commission, I got about 10 seconds into my spiel, and I had printed out my journal article I wrote on the original Project Solarium, and I was really proud of myself when he cut me off and said, Mike, no one else has asked me to be on it, so if that holds, you will have the spot on the commission. And I just bring that up to say I came into this not with a particular expertise on cybersecurity, but a desire to, if nothing else, demystify a lot of what we talk about in cybersecurity. Because while we all have an interest in this space, it's my experience that this can easily devolve into a complex discussion of technology and acronyms. And so I hope you'll see reflected in the final report an attempt to speak in plain language, not only to each other and to the executive branch, but to the American people about the threats we face in cyberspace. And I also came with a desire to demystify a lot of what happened with the original Project Solarium. And by that I mean, I think we have this tendency to look back on the early days of the Cold War and think, well, we just had a bunch of like-minded people that were able to come together and agree on everything and join hands and sing Kumbaya, and that's how we beat the Soviets and laid the foundation for successful containment. I don't believe that's the case. We had very vicious disagreements at that time. We went through multiple variants of containment, even within the Truman administration before we got to Eisenhower. But there was this persistent willingness to challenge each other in good faith to think through the unthinkable, think through the consequences of a nuclear exchange with the Soviets in order to ascertain what we needed to do to avoid that exchange. And I just want to highlight that because I think among the many recommendations in this report, one that I think is absolutely critical is a similar effort today that is needed to think through the unthinkable in cyberspace, think through the consequences of what a massive cyber attack on the United States would look like, what a so-called cyber 9/11 would look like. And that's why you see a lot of recommendations in here on why Congress should mandate the executive branch do continuity of the economy planning. So we think through how we could get the economy back up and moving when we are faced with such a significant cyber attack. And so I just wanted to highlight that because I really think it gets to what was the genius at the heart of the original exercise, which really reflected Eisenhower's style of making decisions. He had this beautiful phrase where, we always remember he said, in times of war, the plans are nothing, but the planning is everything, and that's reflected. But he also said to his subordinates frequently when they're sitting around the National Security Council, there can be no non-concurrence through silence. In other words, you had to speak up. You couldn't claim after the disaster that you actually had the right answer the whole time, but you failed to share it with your colleagues. And similarly, we have tried not to suppress disagreement in this report, but to surface it, and if nothing else, provoke a more thoughtful debate among our colleagues. So I thank you for your attention, I thank you for your engagement, and I thank you for your pushback on our findings, and I yield the rest of my time.
Thank you, Chairman Gallagher. Chair now recognizes Commissioner Patrick Murphy for his opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative Ranking Member Stefanik. I do have written opening testimony that's brief. If it's okay, I'd like to submit it for the record.
So ordered, without objection.
Terrific. And to my other commissioners, thank you so much. Today's a great day to be back in the House Armed Services Committee where I used to serve, and I'm honored to testify today along with my fellow commissioners on the recommendations from the Cyber Solarium Commission's report. Our report has been a lot of blood, sweat, and tears over a year and a bipartisan, bicameral, public-private sector approach. And before I was in political public service, I did serve in the United States Army, and I'm a veteran of the Iraq War. And I now chair innovation at the United States Military Academy at West Point. But when I was appointed to this special bipartisan commission, I was naturally interested in how the United States could preserve and employ the military instrument of power to impose costs on our adversaries and defeat the ghost in our networks. And I want to concentrate my comments today on this important aspect of our commissioned work, because at the end of the day, it is our United States military that is responsible to keeping our families safe here at home. I am firmly in support of our Commission's choice to expand upon the concept of Defend Forward as described in the 2018 Department of Defense cyber strategy to incorporate both military and non-military instruments of power as part of our Commission strategy of Defend Forward and layered cyber deterrence. I believe that this strategy, if endorsed and appropriately resourced by our United States Congress, will ensure that the United States is prepared to impose costs on our adversaries to better deter and, if necessary, fight and win conflicts. It is no secret that our adversaries are using cyberspace to steal national security, intellectual property, and hold U.S. military systems and functions at risk. The latter, in particular, threatens to undermine our deterrence across all of our instruments of warfare. The conventional and nuclear technologically advanced military capabilities that form the bedrock of America's military advantage also create cyber vulnerabilities that our adversaries could exploit to their own benefit. And this is whether it's nuclear, conventional, or cyber, the United States must be confident that its military capabilities will work as intended. Moreover, across the spectrum of engagement, from competition to crisis and conflict, the United States must ensure that its sufficient cyber forces to accomplish our strategic objectives in and through cyberspace. This demands sufficient capability, capacity, and streamlined decision-making processes, enabling rapid and effective cyber response options to impose meaningful cost against adversaries and to respond to adversary action. You know, while our Commission's final report, it boasts over 80 recommendations, but I'd like to draw this committee's attention, this committee in particular's attention, to ensure that you give serious consideration to the following 3 items as it involves defending our nation. First, Congress should direct the Department of Defense to conduct a force structure assessment of the cyber mission force to ensure that the United States has the appropriate force structure and capabilities in light of mission requirements and expectations that are growing in both scope and scale. Additionally, this assessment must also include ensuring sufficient resources for entities within our intelligence community that do play critical combat support agency functions for our U.S. Cyber Command, particularly the NSA. Second, currently the CMF, the Cyber Mission Force, has 133 teams comprised of 6,200 incredible individuals. However, these requirements were determined over 7 years ago in 2013, before the United States fully appreciated the scope and the scale of the threat in cyberspace, which has increased mission requirements on the CMF. A force structure assessment of the CMF is the first step to make sure that we get it right, to ensure that the CMF has appropriately sized forces and sufficiently capable to achieve its objectives. And last, as it relates to defense, Congress needs to direct the Department of Defense to conduct a cybersecurity vulnerability assessment of all the segments of the nuclear command and control system and continually assess weapon systems cyber vulnerabilities. Now let me go to the economy. I thought our co-chairman, Senator Angus King, said it great and appropriately when he said, we are the most wired and vulnerable country in the world. And whether it's my time in the Pentagon, as a soldier overseas, or in the Congress, we understand that the greatness of America is that we do have the #1 economy in the world, and we have the #1 military in the world. And it's up to us to make sure we keep it that way. And as it goes to our economy, I want to make sure that we comment and address the continuity of the economy. I believe the United States must prepare for the cyber day after. The government needs a continuing plan to ensure that critical data and technology remains available after a devastating network attack. During the height of the Cold War, the U.S. government had a plan for the day after. The government did what it needs to ensure that after a massive nuclear strike, how do they ensure that our government and how do we get the private sector operated, especially when it comes to critical infrastructure, getting it back online, and even how to put hard currency back into circulation and begin regenerating our economy. Similar to the necessary plans to manage a pandemic, we currently have no such reconstitution plans for such a cyber event. I strongly believe this Congress should direct the executive branch to develop and maintain this plan in consultation with the private sector to ensure the continuous operation of critical infrastructure of the economy in the event of a significant cyber disruption. Like COOP and COG before it, this would be a critical piece of our national planning. And in similar vein, Congress should codify a cyber state of distress tied to a cyber response and recovery fund to ensure that the CISA and appropriate federal agencies have sufficient resources and capacity to respond to significant cyber incidents before they turn into major disasters. While the NDAA functions to provide the DoD with an annual health and wellness checkup, Congress must not ignore the underlying national security threats that could damage our infrastructure that's owned and operated by the private sector. Because these digital foundations drive the American economy. They spur technological innovation, and they support our United States military. The status quo in cyberspace and this lack of a COPE plan is unacceptable. And we need your help to protect the key elements and enablers that make our military and our country it serves the best in the world. Thanks, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for this opportunity to testify before you today, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Murphy, for those comments. And now, Chair recognizes Commissioner Frank Cilluffo. Frank, for any comments that you'd like to make. You're still muted.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the privilege, Chairman Langevin, to join you today, Ranking Member Stefanik, distinguished representatives, and my fellow commissioners. It really is a privilege to be able to spend a little bit of time with you and share some of our thoughts on the recommendations of our commission's report. The strategy that we have laid out, as Senator King said, is the modern, credible deterrent that the United States urgently needs in cyberspace. The current status quo in which China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea conduct malicious cyber campaigns against their country is, simply put, unacceptable. As my colleagues addressed, it is imperative we move fast, starting with a national cyber strategy and a national cyber director who will focus government efforts on cybersecurity. I also second the call that Patrick was espousing to establish continuity of the economy planning. There can be no more important efforts than the ones to make our nation resilient to cyber attacks. But I thought I'd highlight a couple of other recommendations that are equally as important. First, to footstop what Patrick had mentioned in terms of the cyber mission force, we really do need to conduct that force structure assessment, which is dated in terms of what the gap and the need is today from when that was initially established. And the scope of the threat obviously grows exponentially. And since the bulk of capabilities within DoD to counter malicious adversary campaigns and impose costs are within the CMF, we simply have to ensure that they are resourced and have the authorities to fulfill its job. I think, as Ms. Stefanik rightly put, we must continue to lead and innovate by integrating cyber into our warfighting strategies and doctrine. We need to ensure that we can bring in both the offensive capabilities and the defensive capabilities to lead. Second, as Patrick also mentioned, conventional and nuclear weapon systems. They need to work when needed and as intended. And I just want to double tap the recommendation in terms of conducting a cybersecurity vulnerability assessment of all segments of not only our NC3 or our nuclear command and control systems, but continually assess our conventional weapon system cyber vulnerabilities as well. And we need to do this in a systems of systems approach. You can't look at it in isolation. You need to look at it in its totality. And I also highly support the recommendations that Congress should require defense industrial base participation in threat intelligence sharing programs and threat hunting on the DIB networks. And as I've said before, to preserve and employ the military instrument of power, we must also maintain resilience in our economy and critical infrastructure. And again, I just want to foot stomp the continuity of economy recommendation. I hope Congress can act upon that. Third, the public and private sectors, along with key international partners, must collaborate to build resilience and reshape the cyber ecosystem in a manner that enhances security. This means partnering with the private sector, and especially those that are ideally positioned to scale their impact on the ecosystem, such as IT companies, ISPs, and cloud service providers, and to better secure the services and products that they offer. The Commission recommended a number of important actions that Congress should take now to that effect. One, Congress should establish and fund a national cybersecurity certification and labeling authority for information and communications technology products, and a Bureau of Cyber Statistics to provide a foundation for decision makers to base policies and programs on empirically based evidence. This statistical information should also serve as a platform to facilitate market-based solutions and mechanisms such as cybersecurity insurance. I also want to thank the committee for including DMARC standards in the NDAA. This can go a long way in securing email from phishing and malware attacks. And while we obviously need to be focused on advanced persistent threats, often the first way into one system is through phishing expeditions and the like. And lastly, we need to ensure that our supply chains are trusted, and Congress should direct the U.S. government to develop and implement an industrial base and manufacturing strategy, again, for information technologies and communications technologies. Finally, I would like to focus on a topic that is critical to mission success. We must invest in our nation's cybersecurity workforce. The shortfall between supply and demand in this area is staggering. And it is all the more concerning because the threat continues to expand exponentially and the gap gets greater, not lesser. And we need to, as a matter of national and economic security, we need to redouble our efforts to pull in more veterans and get serious about recruiting and retaining more women, people of color, and neurodiverse individuals. Leveraging different perspectives and diversifying the cybersecurity workforce is not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. The time to act is now. Mr. Chairman, I hope I didn't go over my time, but thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. I look forward to questions, and I really do appreciate your leadership, not only through the Solarium Commission, but for many, many years on cyber-related issues. So thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Salufo, and for your longstanding contributions to the issue of cybersecurity in your own right. So with that, I thank all of our witnesses for the testimony today. We're now going to move to questions. Before I do that, though, I was remiss in not recognizing a couple of other people that were very involved in certainly helping us to get through the recommendations through the Armed Services Committee and into our mark and through the floor. And I want to recognize Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Thornberry for their support, as well as Ranking Member Stefanik and the Staff Director Paul Arcangeli and many others. Let me also recognize my team, Allison Browning, one of my fellows, military fellows, along with Caroline Goodson and Matt Lake, my other military fellow. And I know that Eric Snellgrove as well on the minority side was very helpful. So with that, let me now turn to questions. And if it's conducive, Senator King, if I could start with you, if I could ask, which defense-centric recommendations strike you as the most urgent, whether directed at the executive branch or the legislative branch? You're muted. Just need to unmute.
If I seem a little out of breath, it's because I just voted. I had to go upstairs for a vote, but I was able to listen to Frank's testimony, so I appreciate it. I think, Jim, probably the most significant recommendation that relates indirectly to defense, but is overall is the National Cyber Director. The reality is that right now we have enormously capable people throughout the federal government, but there's no central point of oversight. There's no central point of coordination. There's no central point of defining strategy. And I really think that that's one of the critical recommendations. It's one that's already in your committee bill, which I think is really important. I think secondly, and Patrick Murphy mentioned this, the force structure assessment. We haven't really looked at the force structure in the Defense Department on cyber since 2013. And I think we all know that there have been dramatic changes since then. There have been dramatic changes in the risk, in the complexity, in the adversaries, in the target space. So I think that's probably, I would put that next in line. And then the development of the cyber workforce, because we can talk about force structure, but if we don't have the people to fill those positions with the skills, then we're just not going to make it. For example, a cyber workforce, we have a scholarship program now that's very effective, but it's graduated, I think, 2,000 people in the last 4 or 5 years. We need to or 3,600, I guess. We need to graduate 2,000 a year. I mean, we have a tremendous need for these skilled people. So I would say National Cyber Director, assess the cyber force, and develop workforce would be my first 3 priorities in the military area.
Yeah, very insightful. I completely concur. Thank you for those observations. And we need to grow the size of the cyber pie, not just competing for a bigger slice of it from government standpoint. We need to. It helps both government and private sector to grow the size of the cyber workforce pie. And I concur with the other recommendations that you highlighted. How about Chairman Gallagher? Same question to you. What do you see as the most urgent and important of the 82 recommendations, if you'd like to comment?
Well, I agree with Senator King that I think over time we will realize that the force structure assessment of the cyber mission force will end up having perhaps the biggest impact on DoD over the next decade if we come back with a finding that suggests that we do not have enough personnel dedicated to the issue. But I do think perhaps even more urgent, and it's an area where I know there's still some debate, is to get the authorities right that would allow us to do threat hunting on defense industrial base networks. I think one of our biggest findings in the report was that while we are getting a better awareness of our own systems, we still, down to the level of some of our DoD contractors, subcontractors, all the small companies that work with the big defense primes, don't have the level of visibility on the threat picture and the security of their networks that we need. And so we have a lot of recommendations in Chapter 6 towards that end, and I just would argue that we need to figure that piece out, because we just can't be in the process of reacting to cyber intrusions after the fact. We have to identify those threats at a quicker timeline than that at which our adversaries can break out on networks. So I just would highlight some of what my colleagues have talked about in terms of threat hunting, not only on DoD systems, but on the whole defense industrial base network.
Very good. Thank you for that. Let me turn to Commissioner Murphy now. Commissioner Murphy, based on your time within the Department of the Army as a soldier, as an officer, and a civilian leader, what are your views on the Solarian recommendation on evaluating different models for the reserve component? Are you optimistic that the Army as an institution can accommodate a different model for the reserves than that existed, say, for the last several decades?
I do, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate that question. Can I just address something? I think this is the first time in American history we had someone testifying at the same time voting in the U.S. Senate when Senator King did that about 15 minutes ago. But to your question, Mr. Chairman, Absolutely. We all know that the largest fighting force we have in America is our U.S. Army, about 1 million soldiers strong, 300,000 civilians. But of those 1 million soldiers, unlike the other services, the majority of our soldiers are actually in a reserve component, in the National Guard, in the Army Reserves. And that's why it's critical that when we say we have in the CMF 133 teams, Chairman Milley and I, when we were running the Army, we made it a point that we didn't talk about just the 10 active duty divisions. We were one Army, and we made sure that we fought as one Army. We trained as one Army, and that includes with cyber. So yes, I think our Army now being led very well by my battle buddy from Fort Bragg, Secretary Ryan McCarthy, and also General McConville. They get that, and they are trying to really do what they can in partnership with the HASC and the Congress to make sure that they have that proper balance between the reserve and active components as it relates to cyber, as it relates to CMF. But we need to make sure that as we address this assessment, which we critically need, because remember, Mr. Chairman, in my statement, 7 years ago is when we did the last assessment. That was before we even had Defend Forward. That's when we even had before layered deterrence. So now that we have a bigger footprint digitally, and we are so vulnerable, and as I said, as Senator King mentioned, we are the most vulnerable country in the world because we are so wired. And when we look at the pandemic of coronavirus and what it's done to our economy, imagine the disruption which cyber would do. And that's why, to your point, we need to make sure that we have this assessment and make sure that assessment absolutely positively incorporates the reserve component of our military forces.
Well said. Well said. Thank you all for your the answer to those questions. Very insightful answers, and I thank you again for your work on the commission. With that, now I want to turn to Ranking Member Stefanik for any questions she may have.
Thank you, Chairman Langevin. I wanted to ask Senator King, both in my opening statements and many of our witnesses have touched upon this, and that is the importance of establishing deterrence in cyberspace. That was featured very prominently in the report. But the Commission also notes that true deterrence must be adapted from how it's applied in other domains. What actions can we take to better deter our adversaries, including state actors like Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, from conducting cyber attacks on American interests?
Well, I think there are a series of steps, and one that hasn't really been mentioned very strongly so far is the international community. We're in the infancy of the law of cyber war, if you will, and we need to be more active participants in setting the standards and the guardrails and the norms for activity in cyberspace, so that when we do act, whether it's the imposition of sanctions or other responses, we're not acting alone or unilaterally. Winston Churchill said the only thing worse than fighting with your allies is fighting without allies. And that's one of our major advantages on the world stage with regard to our principal near-peer adversaries of Russia and China. I was in Asia about a year ago, and someone said, America has allies, China has clients. And I think that's step one, is to develop an international set of norms that will themselves be at least some level of deterrent. Secondly, we have to have a clear declaratory policy. I emphasize the word declaratory because if you don't tell your adversary that you'll respond, then it's not a deterrent. And so I think we need to have a much clearer statement of our doctrine, of our strategy, so that adversaries know that they will, in fact, pay a price. The problem has been, you can argue that we have done a good job of deterring catastrophic cyber attacks. Of course, there's no way to measure something that doesn't happen. But we haven't deterred below the threshold of the use of force cyber attacks, whether it's the OPM breach that you mentioned, or the attacks on our election or election infrastructure, or the kind of intellectual property theft. We haven't done a very good job of deterring that. So I think the important thing is to establish the means, the credibility, the credible response, And secondly, to declare it, to make it clear that you will not attack the United States and not have a significant cost imposed upon you. So I think international norms and a clear declaratory strategy. It's not exactly, as you note, I think, as you understand, it's not exactly analogous to the nuclear deterrent. It's a different and more subtle kind of issue. But I do believe that unless we make it clear to our adversaries that they have to calculate that there will be costs imposed, and it doesn't have to be cyber for cyber. It may be sanctions or other kinds of responses. Until they make that calculation, they're going to keep coming after us. So that would be my response to that very good question. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator King. And my next and final question I'm going to address to Congressman or Chairman Gallagher. As you know, oftentimes it's not the DoD or even the federal government that is the target of our adversaries in cyberspace. It's often our cities, our states, universities, or private sector businesses. And many of those entities are ill-suited and frankly ill-prepared to protect against cyber threats from nation states. How do we address this capability gap, and what are some of the Commission's recommendations that address this really important issue where we tend to have siloing within our federal agencies?
That's a great question. I would connect it to your previous question, actually. I actually think this is the primary difference between the logic of strategic nuclear deterrence and the logic of deterrence as we see it in cyberspace, which is that so much of what we're trying to protect and so many of the actors that we're trying to get to buy into that logic are not card-carrying members of the federal government and certainly don't wear uniforms. And so we had a private sector commissioner, Tom Fanning, who runs a major energy company, and he would remind us constantly that 85% of the critical infrastructure in this country is owned by the private sector. I think what you'll also see, to get to the heart of your question, is a good faith effort to thread the needle in this report between the recognition that the federal government has to compel the organizations you identify, be they universities or companies or major banks on Wall Street, against the unwillingness to saddle them with a bunch of counterproductive and onerous regulations that might stifle innovation and entrepreneurship in this country, which, as Senator King and I say at the outset, is our best path to beating China over the long term. So the approach we took, whether it's through recommendations like mandating penetration testing for major publicly traded companies or requiring companies that are part of the defense industrial base to participate in threat intelligence sharing, or establishing a joint planning office within CISA in order to more proactively engage with the private sector so they are actually integrated into our defensive planning process. We get their input on the front end, is a mix, I'd say, of carrots and sticks. We want the C-suite executives to take cybersecurity seriously, and we're prepared to sort of nudge them in that direction. But we also want them to view the federal government as a valuable partner. A partner that understands that in many ways the private sector is the main effort in cyberspace and the federal government is the supporting effort.
Thank you. I yield back.
Very good. Thank you, Ranking Member Stefanik. Mr. Larson is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you. My first question's for Representative Gallagher, and this gets to the business, the private sector side of things. Because we have the cybersecurity maturity model certification process now working its way through the Pentagon and being utilized, mainly focused on smaller businesses within the defense industrial base. Did you look at how that could be or should be integrated with what your recommendations are for private sector cyber hygiene?
I think our view is that it needs to be more expansive than that, and that I think it needs to take a prior step of even understanding who is included in the phrase defense industrial base. We've actually gone through this process before, not in a cyber context, where the Pentagon has actually tried to have what I would call total defense manufacturing visibility. Who are all the companies that are part of this ecosystem? And for whatever reason, we haven't gotten there. It is now even more complex in cyberspace. So I view our recommendations as perhaps building upon the efforts you reference. I know that there are a lot of companies who may not want to participate in that, but I just would say if you're working with the Pentagon, if you're working on systems that are critical to our national defense, and if we know that you are a target for foreign actors, be they state-sponsored hackers from China or cyber criminals, you're going to have to demonstrate a higher level of cybersecurity than those companies have right now.
Yeah. Okay. For Commissioner Murphy, good to see you again, Commissioner. Recommendations recommend that the U.S. strengthen existing bilateral and multilateral relationships. Can you talk specifically how the U.S. could partner with NATO to enable and help their member countries strengthen their systems against cyber attacks?
Absolutely. And Congressman Larson, it's great to be with you again. And I hope your home state of Washington is doing great. On your earlier question, really quick, on the private side sector, I know what the CME see. What we need to do also is that data. Data is king, as you know, and that data and that really that what we're calling the CSET, the Bureau of Cyber Statistics and Emerging Threats. That's critical because we need that to make sure that we have a more robust insurance program, et cetera. So I just want to dovetail on that. But to your question directly, no doubt, what makes America the shining city on the hill is our diplomatic power. You look at the symbol, the American Eagle, 1 talon, 13 arrows, signifying the 13 colonies and our military might. The other talon with the olive branch, showing our diplomatic power. And using smart power. And so with that and with our very specific recommendations that we were tasked to do is asking for a new Assistant Secretary of State. And this one is very, very important because we need to make sure that we strengthen the norms. We make sure that we use that diplomatic power to let other nations like China, like Russia, like Iran know that this is not acceptable. And establishing those norms and making sure that we bring everybody to the table. And I think that's critically important. And we do that by also advocating, frankly, in the White House for the NCD, the National Cyber Director. You know, when we work together in HASC, I'm a big believer in leadership and one throat to choke. And by having one person, one quarterback within the executive office of the president, that National Cyber Director will help make sure we're streamlining within our government and also in the private sector what we need to do to protect our military, to protect our economy and our companies, and also to make sure we're keeping our families and our economy safe.
Yeah, thanks. My final question will be for Commissioner Cilluffo, because you shouldn't be exempt from having to answer questions while you're here. Senator King mentioned paying the price, and that gets into attribution. So can you talk a little bit more deeply about what the Commission considered with regards to a policy of attribution? And second, would attribution apply only to those countries that are specifically listed in the national security strategy, or would it be any country that is participating in cyber intrusions, which sometimes are not those countries that we consider adversaries?
Sir, for the excellent question. I mean, for starters, attribution has improved dramatically over the years. We're not fully where we want to be, but I think we're in a much better place. And I think it's worth noting, and this transcends all of the various questions we've seen here, is that cyber is its own domain, but it transcends all the other domains, whether air, land, sea, space. And there are other means of collection that can be brought to bear to enhance our attribution, whether through technical means or through human sources. So the bottom line is our attribution is improving. You've probably noted a big uptick in at least Five Eyes countries coming together and doing joint and shared attribution. I think this actually is having some very positive net effect in terms of some of our adversaries and actually putting them on notice, as Senator King was discussing earlier. So we need to be able to have some declaratory sort of impact. And I might note our transatlantic partners with NATO, you've also seen an uptick in joint attribution. Bottom line is just the facts, man. We got to be going where the facts arise. Obviously, there are other potential diplomatic questions when discussing allies, but But I think that in terms of informing our USG entities and some of our .com entities, we've got a responsibility to do that as the US government. So long-winded way of saying, I think you're going to see us moving out from our Five Eyes to our NATO partners, to allies that don't exist in any of those organizations, such as South Korea, Japan, Israel, and a handful of others, and then build India and building out from there. So I think we've made some progress. We've got to continue to do more, and we've got to hold our adversaries to account. There have to be consequences. There has to be impact. And I think it's worth noting that we do suggest we lean forward in a lot of these issues. We do support the defend forward concept, persistent engagement concept, but not only through the lens of the military. That's a crucial element of it, but all instruments of statecraft.
Very good.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Larson. Before we go to Mr. Bacon, I'll comment and say that Mr. Solufo's answer is absolutely right. We are getting better at attribution. What we do need to do, though, is shorten the timeline between incident and our response. I applaud the Europeans for the sanctions that they put on the entities that were responsible for several high-profile attacks or intrusions. But those things happened, several months ago. There's such a long lag between action and consequence. If I think both the United States, Europeans are partners. We need to work more quickly to close that gap between action, between incident and response. So we punish the bad actors, and they realize it's relevant to the action. With that, Mr. Bacon is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you there, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the Commission for the hard work, very thoughtful discussion, great product, so I appreciate it. I'm not sure who to target the questions to, so I'll just, whoever feels best to answer them, just jump in there. But I'm curious to hear more about the National Cyber Director, and the reason is our cyber attack is under a cyber command primarily. Cyber intelligence is primarily under NSA, but what's most worrisome is the cyber defense. It's really, there's no single authority. So is this National Cyber Director and the team that we're putting in the executive branch or that you're proposing, is it primarily focused on the defense end, or does it involve all three, attack, intelligence, defense? And if it's all three, how would that impact the chain of command for a cyber attack? Is it that command goes through the cyber commander, Secretary of Defense, and the President? So I'm just sort of curious to hear more. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, perhaps I can take that. That's
Sure.
a really good question. The purpose of the National Cyber Director is planning and coordination, not operations. So the chain of command between between Cyber Command, Secretary of Defense, and the President would not be interrupted. That's not the purpose of this new office in the Executive Office of the President. We want this person to be accountable for the coordination, but would not have an operational role. Also, a piece of it is planning, as we've been talking about, and coordinating planning throughout, whether it's in CISA, in Homeland Security, or in other in NIST, or wherever it is in the federal government. But I think the specific answer to your question is we're not talking about operations for this position, but coordination, planning, and budget coordination. This person would have an oversight over the budgets of the various agencies, not a veto, but a recommendation and a certification through the OMB process. Again, the whole idea is to bring some level of I guess I'd call it just sensible organization, because right now there's nobody in charge. But to answer your specific question, it's still Cyber Command, Secretary of Defense, President of the United States.
Thank you very much, Senator. I appreciate that. I surely see a need on the defense side. There is a very diffused responsibilities on defense, and it just seems to me that there is a definite need, at least on that part of our cyber operations. Changing topics, I had a little experience with cyber being in the Air Force for a long time, and it seems, if I could generalize, Russia is more focused on military cyber, IO, China a lot more in the economic intelligence. Is that generalizations, or is that still considered, by and large, still the case?
Well, I think that's largely right, though neither, Russia would ignore the economic domain, nor would China ignore the military domain. I think if you read the report, and in particular the threat analysis portion of the report, it is clear that we agree with the fundamental finding of the national security strategy and the national defense strategy that China is the pacing threat. China is the pacing threat in cyber. In terms of the sheer resources they're devoting to this issue, I think we're concerned about Russia. We talk about Russia. We're concerned about non-state actors, but China really comes out as a threat that organizes a lot of our response. I'm not disagreeing with your analysis, but at least a lot of what I realized in the course of participating in this commission was that we are insufficiently concerned with the actions of the Chinese Communist Party in cyber.
Well, I appreciate that. And my generalizations were going back, not necessarily current, so just curious if it was still the case. I think the areas that concern me most is the energy sector and the financial sector, whether it's Wall Street. I really think China or Russia would really create havoc with focused attacks in those areas, and we obviously got to raise our game if we want to defend those two critical parts of our country.
Well, maybe I can connect it to your first question. I think, under the doctrine of civil-military fusion, China's not making these clear, siloed distinctions between military operations and sort of economic warfare. And I do think that's an area where we hope the National Cyber Director can step up and lead that defensive effort. One of our biggest findings in the report was that a lot of the work that this committee has done in recent years in the FY19 NDAA to make cyber surveillance and reconnaissance a traditional military activity, and then to have NSPM 13 layered on top of that, has really been a positive development and helped us on the offensive side. We need similar attention paid to the defensive side so that someone in the federal government is the single belly button we can push and is proactively reaching out to the banks and the financial community to say, hey, here's what we're thinking. What input do you have for us?
Chairman Gallagher, I agree. I yield. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Mr. Bacon. I have next on my list, I have Congressman Khanna, but I don't know that he is still there. Are there any members that have not been recognized that would like to be recognized?
We're all good in the room, Jim.
Okay. I guess I had one more question on continuity of the economy. And would anybody like to comment on, and I agree that the comments that were made earlier about continuity of the economy, very important. Commissioner Murphy addressed a lot of these, but the role do you see, say, in Department of Treasury, Department of Commerce, and then independent agencies like the Federal Reserve in a continuity of the economy plan and proposal, and any thoughts on how that should work?
Jim, let me start off on that, or I should say, Congressman, sorry. I think one thing the pandemic has taught us is that the unthinkable can happen. If you had told us all a year ago we'd be wearing masks and we'd have a large part of our economy having severe difficulty, all the things that are happening, it would have sounded like science fiction. The unthinkable can happen, and that's really what we're talking about here. And I think one of the problems that our commission tried to attack head on was the fact that's been alluded to today, and the prior questioner mentioned this in terms of the financial sector, the energy sector. The target is mostly in the private sector. So the continuity of the economy, the planning has to engage the private sector. We have to determine what are the crucial elements, what are the crucial sectors that need to be functioning no matter what, and how do we ensure their protection. I think this is one of our most important recommendations. This is one that's in the Senate bill. I don't think it's in the House bill, and hopefully we're going to be able to pull it through in the conference committee.
That's
but
the plan.
We've really got to be thinking about and an ounce of prevention is a pound of cure. I mean, we've got to be thinking about how to react when the unthinkable happens. And if everybody's pointing at one another and there's no plan on the shelf, it's going to be infinitely worse and take infinitely longer to recover. So I think this is one of our most important recommendations. And overall, I think one of the most important insights of the commission was the extent to which we had to really forge a new relationship. We have to think in a new way about how we relate, how the government and the private sector relate in terms of sharing intelligence, sharing attack data, cooperating, talking to allies. I mean, it's really a very comprehensive approach to this, and I think that's one of the significant insights that we bring to the table in the report. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, can I add a thought on that particular?
Please,
So, I mean, when we talk about the continuity of the economy, it did, as Senator King said, it became loud and clear just how important that is in a post-COVID environment, both directly and indirectly. And one of the things we did really zero in on, if you think about an X and a Y axis, you have our critical infrastructures, and some are even more so critical than others. And we mentioned a couple of them already here today, energy, financial services, telecommunications, and obviously the defense industrial base. But then also on a Y-axis, we've got these critical functions. So agnostic to the particular sector, whether it's the cloud or whether it's timing and signaling from a GPS perspective or a PNT, assured positioning, navigation, timing and signaling kind of perspective. This is how we've got to start racking and stacking some of these issues. And I might note for the Armed Services Committee as a whole, the challenge around mission assurance, or the ability for DOD to rely upon civilian entities and critical infrastructures to project power, deploy forces. This is a tough. We've got to put, this is a tough circle to put in a square sort of peg. So I think this is where the interaction between DOD and CISA at DHS and FBI as well from an investigatory standpoint becomes so important. And I think that just makes the case for our National Cyber Director that much more important. So we at least have the visibility across the various playbooks that can come together to be able to make sure that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And this was a point that came up in various questions as well. I mean, at the end of the day, what I think is so important is also on the intelligence side. The new National Cyber Directorate that was stood up at NSA is going to play a very important role in enabling CISA, so CISA can better reach out to our state, local, tribal, territorial partners, and of course the private sector, and same thing in terms of FBI. So this again may not sound sexy, but it's the spaghetti org chart right now that needs to be tamed a little bit and brought under control.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, can I just foot stomp on what Frank just said real quick,
Sure.
Sir, if that's okay with you? 1 minute. Two things. One, we are going to get caught with our pants down if we don't focus on continuity of the economy, period. And that's why, my opening statement, I talked about making sure that we have Congress codifying a cyber state of distress that's tied to that cyber response recovery fund. Also, that we need to direct the executive branch and make sure that we do have a continuity of the economy planning that's in consultation with the private sector. We absolutely need to do that. I'd also say to you, when we talk about the NCD, National Cyber Director, why that's critically important, as Frank just said about when he's talking about DHS and CISA and making sure state and local, we also need to ensure that our allies, that's why we're calling for that Assistant Secretary of State, that our allies aren't a launching pad to hurt us here or hurt our private sector clients or our military. But secondly, that we can more quickly do attribution. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Commissioner Murphy, and to all of our commissioners for those answers on that topic. That concludes my questions. I will turn down to Ranking Member Stefanik for any final questions she may have.
I'm all set, Jim. Thank you to our witnesses.
Okay. All right. Are there any members in the room that I can't see that have not been recognized that would like to ask a question?
Nope, we're all set.
Okay. Well, with that, let me conclude by thanking all the members of the commission. You did an extraordinary job here today, but even more extraordinary job in the commission, both Senator King and Congressman Gallagher, our two co-chairs, and Commissioner Murphy, Commissioner Salufo, and the rest of the commissioners, thank you all for your extraordinary work. You've made a major contribution to better protecting the country in cyberspace with your combined efforts, and I was honored and privileged to be one of the 4 members of Congress joining you on the commission. It was one of the highlights of my 20 years in Congress to be a part of this effort, and I found it so meaningful, and again, time well spent. And I like the fact from the very beginning that we determined that we were not going to allow just this to be a report that would sit on a shelf somewhere, but we wanted actionable findings, recommendations that we could implement and again achieve meaningful change. So with that, I thank you all for your participation today, for your service to the country. With that, the hearing now stands adjourned.